What did the Egyptians look like?
All right, so how are you going to respond to that, Professor?
They look like human beings, like any other human beings.
No. Professor, what's your name again? What's your name? Chris. No. Have some courage. Stand the ground, use the sources, and tell it how it is. That's what we need in our day and age. The courage to speak the truth based on the sources. Be a man, tell it how it is. So since you didn't, I'm gonna do it for your audience. Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we have a winner. We have a winner for the best thumbnail face that has ever thumbnailed. That is beautiful. I'm so gonna use it. I'm so gonna put it on this thumbnail. I'm gonna have to move this one a little bit. This is yeah, perfect. I don't know if this video gonna be good. I watched a little bit of it, but I'm just gonna watch it with you. It has 25 chapters. Don't even know if I can cover all of them. But then again, the face of the Egyptologist, I suppose, considering the title is What Do We Know About Ancient Egypt? Yeah, what do we know about ancient Egypt? The face is a perfect representation of how I feel when I read some of the things that people say online about the ancient Egyptians. So, you know, a topic that I have covered a few times on this channel, and if you've been following me for a while, a topic for which I've got a little bit of backlash, shall we say. But I welcome it. I relish in the backlash. You know why? Because I relish in the truth. I love the truth. The thing that I like the most about the truth is that it only cares about documented facts and reality checks. You can get offended by it. You can hate it, you can try to hide it, you can run away for it. I mean, at the end of the day, if a topic makes you uncomfortable, just don't cover it. That's fine. But the truth stays the same, regardless of people's feelings. So, being a person who's just gonna tell it how it is, no matter who it offends, this is a wonderful topic. So let's see how he handles, because I know how I handle it, but let's see how he, this Egyptologist, handles the sort of questions that I know he's gonna get. So let's go. It's gonna be great today. Amon-Ra, protect this man. Okay, so I think I want to start by having a look at what we've got to work with. So let's see what these chapters are. So we start with introduction, all right? When did the Egyptians live? Why did the Egyptians build pyramids? How did the Egyptians build pyramids? That's the, yeah, I want to see if he says aliens here. How did the Egyptians cut granite? Why were the Egyptians obsessed with cats? When were they obsessed? I don't know if I use the word obsessed. Did the Egyptians believe in the afterlife? That's good. Why did the Egyptians mummify their dead? Why did the Egyptians put organs in jars? What did Egyptians look like? Ooh, oh, here it is. Here it is. Oh, this is gonna be fire. What is he gonna say? Because no matter what he says, he's gonna be hated for it. It's just change it. The only variable here is who's gonna hate him. Not me, because I'm okay with people disagreeing in a civil manner, but people online with this topic? Oh my gosh. Why did Egyptians wear eyeliner? Why did Egyptians shave their heads? That's interesting. What did Egyptians wear? Hieroglyphics. How did they become pharaohs? False beards. Why did the pharaohs marry their siblings? And we can also talk about the Ptolemaic dynasty in that case. How long did Egyptians live? What did Egyptians eat and drink? That's very interesting, and I'm glad it's kind of substantial. What jobs did Egyptians do? Why did Egyptians believe in curses? How many gods did Egyptians have? I'm surprised it's such a small one, to be honest. Did the Egyptians have electricity? Electricity? Yeah, I mean, I think his answer is they didn't, and that's why it's this short. Who did the Egyptians fight? Oh, that's good. And did the Egyptians have slaves? Okay, so this one, it's kind of a shame that it's at the end, because we could tackle like the new information about how the pyramids were built, which previously I was taught that they were built through slave work, but actually new evidence came forth not too long ago, presenting the idea that in fact a lot of these were contract workers. So that could be a very interesting one to cover, something that I myself had to sort of relearn, because unfortunately sometimes you get taught wrong, right? And that's why you always want to double check everything, including what I say. Double check what I say, always use critical thinking. What I'm going to do, I'm actually going to move around the chapters. We're not going to go in a chronological order. We're going to go in a interest order. But let's begin with the intro.
Why were the Egyptians obsessed with cats? It is true that the pharaohs did marry their sisters. It's a fair bet that if there was another great power in the ancient Mediterranean world at any point, Egypt probably fought them. I know some people think maybe the pyramids were power stations or something, but anyway, they weren't. They didn't have electricity. Next!
Okay, good start. Fun.
Hello, Chris Norton here. History Hit have given me the task of answering Google's top Egyptology-related questions. Don't know what these are going to be, so let's get going. First question, when did the Egyptians live?
Right.
I suppose, not to be flippant, if you went to Egypt now and said, when did the Egyptians live, they'd probably say, well, what do you mean, now? Ancient Egyptians, we think of ancient Egypt as being to do with pharaohs and hieroglyphs and people standing on their side and gods in human form with animal heads. That civilization is established by about 3000 BC, about 5,000 years ago, and decisively, if there's any one particular moment at which it...
I think I'm going to speed him up a little bit, and not to be disrespectful to the professor, but, you know, he's not a creator, so I think he's not used to speaking at a certain speed to entertain audiences, so let's do that.
Ends, and there isn't, but if you had to pick a date, you'd probably say in the 7th century AD at the time of the Arab conquest, when Islam arrives in Egypt, along with the Arabic language and script. So altogether, about 3 and a bit more than half a thousand years from.
I wish Egyptian was still a spoken language, by the way. That is one of the things that I'm mostly, the fact that we lost first for a long time, the ability to even read the hieroglyphs. Of course, that's been recovered after certain archaeological findings, such as the famous Rosetta Stone. But in general, the fact that it's not a spoken language anymore and that a lot of the vowels that we use are conventional. Some are recreated through Coptic, but others we have absolutely no idea. So when the Egyptologists are reading hieroglyphs, sometimes they just have to put a E of convention, so E of convention, but we don't actually know precisely what it sounded like. In fact, we have reconstructed Latin a lot more closely, and we are a lot more confident what ancient Greek sounded like, including Attic dialect. But unfortunately, when it comes to Egyptian, I wish it was still a spoken language. I really do.
5,000 years ago. Long time. Next question. Why did the Egyptians build pyramids? Pyramids were monumental tombs marking the burial place and sometimes containing the burial place of the pharaoh. Having said that, in later periods, pyramid is abandoned as a part of the royal tomb complex, but it continues in use as a marker for non-royal tombs. So pyramids are monuments that mark the burial places of dead people.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think they're a status and a representation of wealth and power, both for the people alive, because of course these are built while the pharaoh is still alive. They also act as a way to show, look how powerful and wealthy and godlike I am as a pharaoh. So that's also one of the reasons. It is a funerary building, but it also acts as a manifestation of power onto the people that are period to the pharaoh, to kind of also project a certain level of authority onto them, to scare them, amaze them, the subjects, but also to people in the future.
Next question. How did the Egyptians build pyramids?
There we go.
The answer is we don't entirely know.
Yeah.
There are lots of theories about how we did it, some more far-fetched than others. I think it's fair to say that it was a lot of people and a lot of ropes over a long period of time.
I don't know about the ropes, because I remember seeing the ropes and the logs. That's like the classic explanation, if you will. And I think that that was just our best guess that we could put together in the, I want to say, what, 60s, 50s, 70s, pretty much. Or maybe even earlier than that, because, although then again, I usually don't like referring to 1800s Egyptology because it gets really dark and sometimes we're even like pseudo-scientific. But at least when we get to something even a bit more modern, the 70s, the idea with ropes and logs has never really fully convinced me. There must have been something that they knew how to do, or some technique, maybe a certain usage of metal, an understanding of the types of stones that they were using, and something that we really haven't figured out, because we still don't know. Even with the ropes and logs theory, which we find in like the old school books of the 80s, we still don't know how they did it. Like, we couldn't replicate it today, which I think is fascinating.
But as to exactly how they moved all those huge stones into position, when we're thinking about the biggest, grandest pyramids of the Old Kingdom, say, we don't exactly know. What did the Egyptians look like?
All right. So how are you going to respond to that, Professor?
I suppose we know how the Egyptians wanted to appear from their art, and it's very interesting that in some cases, even when we know individuals were old and maybe not in what we would think of as the best shape physically, they depicted themselves in, say, statues and paintings as being youthful and unblemished, which is a kind of window into how they wanted to look, maybe. We know, to some extent, what some of them actually looked like, perhaps from the very best preserved mummies, which, even if they don't have the same appearance that the individual would have had in death, they capture something of the features of the person.
Yeah, the mummies can absolutely be used to study that, but also iconography. Maybe I would have spoken about iconography, wall paintings, mural art before speaking about the mummies, but the mummies are absolutely part of it.
The person, they look like human beings, like any other human beings.
No. Professor, what's your name again? What's your name? Chris. No. That's a cop-out. That is a massive cop-out. Why are you not... You know exactly what this question is asking. Let's stop playing dumb here. Because obviously dumb, you're not. You're very intelligent. The Egyptians looked like human beings? Come on. Have some courage. Stand the ground. Use the sources, the iconography, the descriptions, the paintings, the murals, the statues, the mummies, and tell it how it is. That's what we need in our day and age. The courage to speak the truth based on the sources. Are you afraid? Like, who are you afraid of? That they're going to call you a racist? So what? They're clowns. You know, this is the problem that I have with this topic, and unfortunately much of academia these days. Not all academia, but much of academia these days. They're afraid. They're afraid because they know that this topic is going to be inflammatory. And of course, no matter what he says, if he says, oh, the ancient Egyptians were all white, oh, he's going to be devoured alive. But the same way, if he says the ancient Egyptians were all black, then there is going to be a whole other side of people that are going to go after him and call him all sorts of names. So at the end of the day, the reality of fact is that they were mixed. And I say it here, and I will state it until evidence will prove otherwise. They were a mixed people. At the end of the day, even if people disagree, just state what the facts say, which you know what they say. Tell it how it is. And then the decent people, even if they disagree with you, if they are decent and civil, they will say, Professor, respectfully, thanks for the presentation, but I disagree. I think they were all black, or I think they were all white, or I think they were all green, and here is why, and here is who I quote, and that's the literary or whatever, or the iconography, and that's the YouTube video that I watched, whatever it is their source is, and they'll put it in there, and they will initiate discourse. That's how it works. I'm not the one who is supposed to explain that because you are an academic, you know that. I mean, at the end of the day, the only people that are gonna get pissed at you if you actually don't give this sort of answer, the people that are gonna get pissed are those that otherwise were gonna call you a racist, a liar. I take these types and put them into the same box. Clowns! They don't matter, they hate you anyways, unless you say it exactly as they want. Someone who is decent, someone like me, someone like the people in my audience, someone who is decent, you know what they're going to say? If you say they were all white, they're going to tell you, Professor, I disagree for this, and that reason. If you say they were all black, they're not going to call you woke, horrible woke. They're not going to do that. They're going to tell you, Professor, I don't know why you say that since we have this, and that. And that's it. And these are the people you need to care about. The rest are clowns. They mean nothing. If anything, whenever I get them, which I do, because contrary to you, I don't cop out. I stand my ground. You know what I do? I don't read their comments anymore. So they spam my comment section. My audience sees that, sees all the accusations, the attack, Metron is a racist, blah, blah, blah. They defend me. They fight my battles, which, by the way, I appreciate. It becomes a flame war in the comments. I monetize the shit out of it, and that creates hard cash. And I turn support for decent people and hatred from the clowns into monetary gain. I'm a medieval alchemist, that's what I am. You know, lead into gold? Well, here we are. Now, I get it, not everyone has got the guts to stand against the backlash. That's fine. And I'm not going to shame you for it. I understand. But in that case, then you have to ask the editor in this case and tell them, now listen, cut that part out because I don't feel comfortable speaking about it. I just don't want to do it. Then cut it out. But if you're going to leave it on, then don't give me the cop out because then I'm not going to respect you. That's just how it is. They looked like human beings. What does that even mean? We all look different, which is a great thing, by the way. I like the fact that there is so much diversity in the world. It's like having multiple colors on a beautiful painting. But be a man, tell it how it is. So since you didn't, I'm going to do it for your audience and mine. The ancient Egyptians were a multi-ethnic civilization. Hate me all you want, I'm still gonna say it. And the ancient Egyptians were mixed. And the percentages of those people, the way they looked, the way, when it comes in general to the ethnic percentages, varied period from period from period. Because of course, if you look at the late Egyptian era, when they were under Ptolemaic rule, and there were quite a few Greek colonizers and colonies that were being built in ancient Egypt, then when you look at the ancient Egyptian population as a whole, a certain percentage, including the ruling elites, would have been white, or Mediterranean Europeans, Greek, if you don't want to use white, because perhaps you only use it in the Benjamin Franklin Anglo-Saxon way. If that's how you use it, I don't. I mean it as white-skinned Europeans like me, but if that's not the way you use it, don't want to use white, don't use white, then they are Greek. They are Greek. They looked Greek, like Mediterranean people. I'm a Mediterranean, by the way. I'm from Sicily. Can't get more Mediterranean than me. But that would only be a small percentage of the Egyptian in a almost insignificant section of a few hundred years that would be the later part, and then it becomes under Roman rule all the way up to, as he says, the Arab conquest. That would be the section where you would have the highest number of European-looking types within the Egyptian ethnic strata. Before that, the Egyptians would have looked a mixture between brown, olive skin, no matter how much people hate that word, it's still a word and I'm gonna use it, and black, although then again, the highest percentages of black people, which some use the term sub-Saharan, I kind of stopped using that because it's not exactly a great descriptive term in my humble opinion. You can hate me if you want, but once again, woke, okay, great. There would have been a higher percentage of black Egyptians in Upper Egypt, some of which were priests, some of which have even become pharaohs at one point. You have the Nubian thing, and it's precisely because of the border shared with the Nubians that Upper Egypt, so the southern part of Egypt, because their maps were upside down from a European modern perspective, that's where you would have had the higher percentage of black Egyptians. So some black Egyptians absolutely existed. It would be interesting to see if we could go all the way back to the first, second, and third dynasty, what those percentages would be. I'm very open to look at that. How many were brown? How many were black? How many were olive? Very difficult to say, contrary to what other people say. They make categorical statements of the first dynasty is so moronic considering the lack of evidence comparatively. But regardless, it's a mixed civilization, and that is the closest we get to the truth based on the documented evidence we have. It is what it is. They will use all sorts of, but look at the paintings. The paintings would have looked darker, definitely, because pigments get darker. And I've proven multiple times on this channel, not with all this YouTube nonsense, but with actual studies from the University of Florence on the pigmentation of specifically the tomb of Seti I, which is one of those that is wrongly used by those who push certain ideas, by the way, as I have debunked already multiple times. They showed that sometimes pigments get darker, and that's a fact. It's a fact. So yes, sometimes pigments fade, in which case the color used to represent the skin tone of the people, if that mattered that much for some reasons. For some people, that's all that matters, but of course they are invested and they have conflict of interest because they sell books about it. Regardless, I don't particularly care. But if I'm asked a question, I will respect the student or the person watching and give them the correct answer. And once again, these are facts. I've presented all the documentation. I've shown all the experts mentioning this, specifically with Seti I, and people still reject it because he's racist. Well, call me racist all you want. All that does is make me want to make more videos about it. Stand for the truth.
In answer to the question, what do they look like? And I suppose that's one of the reasons why mummies are so compelling for people. Ancient Egypt seems very far away and exotic, and when you look at the best preserved mummies, you think, oh right, they were just people.
So you look at the mummies and you think, oh, they were just people? Oh my gosh. Chris, can I call you Chris? This was a monumental L, as big as the pyramid of Cheops. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.
How did the Egyptians cut granite? We don't exactly know. We know that they certainly were doing it. They used granite and a lot for statuary, for the finer parts of their most important buildings, temples, tombs, at times. We know that they were very clever at exploiting weaknesses in the rock. So obviously the rock comes from granite quarries. We know that they were able to exploit weak points. So they would go for cracks or weaker parts in the rock. They would then work into those with harder, even stone pounders. To begin with, the only metals in the early parts of Egyptian history, the only metals they had access to were...
Yeah, copper, bronze and iron. So before he says that, I do want to underline one thing, because he's giving a good explanation here. But when he says they, let's not consider that as, oh, the Egyptians, but let's just say the specialized workers. That's what they means. And probably these were specialized workers that were doing it for generations. So it's a generational thing. This happened in Japan as well. I mean, granite, thank you for the pronunciation, by the way, is something that the Romans worked with as well. The Romans worked with marble. In fact, they preferred it over other types of stones, but the Romans used limestone as well, which is one of the reasons why they built Parisi, which is modern-day Paris, pretty much. Well, Parisi was the Celtic name. The Romans called it Lutetia, but the reason why they started working on it is precisely because they had limestone quarries, digs underneath, and then they could build quarries and then use that stone as a material to continue building the town. Regardless, these are specialized workers, probably generational. So the fact that they were extremely skilled is something you have to imagine as hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of expertise for these quarry masters.
Copper, bronze comes later, iron later than that. But they were using a combination of hard stones, metals of various kinds, weaknesses in the stone, and then most probably kind of friction agents like sand or the crystalline chippings of harder stones to kind of to use as an abrasive to wear the stone down.
Sure.
It'd be good to be able to travel back in time and see exactly what they were doing. Again, maybe not a great answer, but we probably don't know exactly.
No, I think it's a good answer because it's an honest answer. He's not trying to make things up. He's trying to speak based on what we have, and we don't have a lot to work with. Also because this is a very ancient civilization, and of course, the further back in time you go, the harder it is to make definitive statements, particularly when there is lack of primary sources that tell us exactly how this works, and material goods and all that sort of evidence.
Why were the Egyptians obsessed with cats? I think I want to say that they weren't obsessed with cats, actually. I think the Egyptians had domestic cats. They kept cats as pets. Cats of various kinds were a part of the natural environment in Egypt. The Egyptians imagined some of their gods and goddesses taking on the form of cats. I think it probably seems to us now like they were obsessed with cats because of one or two extremely fine examples of images of cats, for example, in sculpture, which have come down to us and are among the most striking images we have from ancient Egypt, and that's given us the idea that they were obsessed with them. But I think probably they weren't very much more obsessed with cats than with a whole variety of other animals that were important to them.
Yeah, and you know how I know that? Because my cousin is obsessed with cats. I know exactly what obsessed with cats means, and I have to agree with the Egyptologist in this case.
Did the Egyptians believe in an afterlife?
Yes.
Yes, emphatically they did believe in an afterlife, and they had a very elaborate set of beliefs about what happens to a person in death. We have a massive amount of evidence, texts and images on papyri, on tomb walls, to do with objects that they wanted to carry with them that speak to what they believe happens in the next life. So yes, there is a massive amount we could say about the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife. Did they have a belief in the afterlife? Yes, they definitely did. That
actually connects, of course, to mummification, but I think it's one of the sub-chapters, so I'm just going to let him speak.
Why did the Egyptians mummify their dead?
There we go.
Essentially, they believed that if the individual was going to make the journey to the next life successfully, then their mortal remains, their physical body, had to be preserved for various reasons. If that didn't happen, then they wouldn't be able to make the journey to the next life. So mummifying the body is essential. Why did the Egyptians put organs in jars? At a certain point, as part of the mummification process, the Egyptians must have realised that certain internal organs contain impurities which assist with the process of decomposition of the body. So if you remove those organs, then that arrests that process to some extent. So the liver, lungs, stomach and intestines were taken out, and that helped the embalmers to keep the body pure and helped with the process of keeping the rest of it well preserved.
Very interesting. There is a lot that can be said about mummification because it is something like the balms that they use, the sort of techniques that they used to achieve it. That could be actually an interesting video on ancient Egypt that we could tackle at one point, particularly if we want to start, speaking, because I've made the controversial videos on Egypt when we talk about ethnicity, when we talk about that sort of stuff. But I've also made a video on religion. I made a video on the military. So it's not like that's all we talk about, contrary to what some of my detractors say. And I think it would be an interesting thing to maybe have one about specifically their burial rituals, including the techniques of mummification, and then maybe jump on a few studies that have been done on mummies. That would be very interesting, without necessarily talk about the controversial topics. Not every video has to be controversial. Is this one gonna be, though?
Why did the Egyptians wear eyeliner? Because they thought it made them look nicer. I don't have a better answer than that. I bet my colleagues do. Why did the Egyptians shave their heads? And this is about purification. Hair harbours lice, nits, bugs, things that can cause disease. So the best way of getting around that potential problem is to not have any hair.
Or wash it.
Shave your hair and instead to wear a wig, which is what the Egyptians often did. Purity, the idea of purification, is something that's particularly associated with priesthood and temple rituals and gods and goddesses, and for that reason priests are often shown with shaven heads where other individuals are shown in art wearing wigs.
There you go.
So it's about purity, cleanliness, I think.
You see, that's a good answer, the one he just said. That's why priests would shown often, for example, in iconography with a shaved head, because they are the ones that are most connected with the idea of purity. That's a great answer. Now imagine if we had to look at it from the lenses of, but what if it offends people with long hair? Are you saying that people with long hair are not pure? Is that what you said? Imagine that. What if it offends people with no hair? Or are you saying that unless I'm a priest, then I'm not? Like, you can't. I know I'm building a straw man here. I understand. But I'm doing it on purpose to show you how silly it is to really care about the people that get offended. I hope it doesn't become the defining feature of this century when they look back at us in 3024. Because if they do, then if this video remains, I want it for the record. I do not get offended. I have nothing whatsoever to do with the people that get offended at everything. Nothing, not me. Okay, so if this is shown to people in 3024, not me. I wasn't like that.
What did the Egyptians wear? We know, again from art, a certain amount about Egyptian clothing. We have in some contexts actual Egyptian clothing preserved. Typically speaking, Egyptian men are depicted wearing a kilt worn from the waist and stretching down to just above the knees. There were various different kinds of kilts, but essentially they would cover the area from the waist down to about the knees. Women generally wore longer garments, covering them from, I guess, just below the neck down to the ankles. But there was quite a bit of variety in the things that men and women wore. They would also, of course, be adorned with jewellery for those who could afford it, wigs.
I think the idea that there would be variety between the way men and women were dressing is something you can say all the way up to, what, the 50s? 60s maybe is when things start to change. In that day and age, there isn't that much of a difference, is there? I mean, at the end of the day, you can have a girl, a boy, a woman, and a man, and we're wearing jeans and t-shirts, a pair of sneakers or trainers, and that's it. And to me, it's a little bit of a shame, honestly, because just as a person, I'm not trying to be like closed-minded or no, you can do whatever you want, dress as you please, as long as it's decent in certain contexts, of course. But generally speaking, I want to say that I miss the stark difference between man wear and woman wear, for example, in the 40s, in the 50s, and even earlier than that, in fact, not even the 40s, but the 1800s, how women had all those beautiful dresses, oh my gosh, to die for, very feminine. And then you could see a massive stark contrast with the way a man would be dressed. I find some beauty in it, very elegant. And so to me, it's something we lost when it comes to a fashion. Particularly when we went in the 90s, the whole thing with the jeans that are all like cut and broken and with tears. I never really was into that, I'll be honest with you. It is what it is. Sometimes when you look back at the past, I think they had a better style. All the way back to the medieval period, which is why I'm wearing a late 15th century arming doublet based on the paintings by Piero della Francesca from Tuscany.
Headgear of various kinds, makeup. We know that they wore sandals on their feet. The tomb of Tutankhamun is probably the best example of an archaeological situation that preserves clothing. Tutankhamun was buried with dozens of pairs of sandals, various tunics, headgear of various kinds, a massive amount of jewellery, and even loincloths, pharaonic pants, as it were, which always sticks in my mind for some reason.
I wonder why we lost the concept of headgears. We don't really wear hats anymore. Well, some people do, but I'm saying in general, compared to, say, even once again, the 40s, the 50s, when men that were wearing suits and maybe a coat were always wearing a hat. Isn't that nice? Like, it completes the outfit, doesn't it? I wonder why we lost that. Yeah, some people wear a cap in our day and age, but we don't really, even women with their beautiful hats that they were wearing with their long dresses in the 1800s, for instance. I think a hat is something that has been present through so many cultures and so many centuries. I really wonder why we stopped wearing them.
Why did the Egyptians use hieroglyphics? The hieroglyphic script is the first of the scripts used to write the Egyptian language. So it's a system for writing. Why they used the little pictographic signs that we recognize, little pictures of men and animals and birds and plants and things, we can't know, except that there must have been a point somewhere lost to us now in the deepest, darkest depths of early Egyptian history, when somebody decided that there needed to be a way of capturing information about things by making marks on some kind of surface. And maybe the best way that person thought to do that was to use images of the things he wanted to convey information about.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that is the first form of material communication, is the hand drawings and pictures, if you will, on stones, on cave walls in the Stone Age. So that's something that goes as ancient. I mean, if you think about it, you see an object, you want to represent that object, it makes sense that you will develop a way with using like earth-based colors and whatever you have available to represent that thing that you're seeing the way it looks, before you create a symbol that is only a representation for it, and then all the way to phonetics and like a symbol that now sounds like you say it. It makes sense. It's a logical process. And also there is an aspect, I think, in connection with mystical power. The idea that once I represent something, then I have that thing. It is mine. I control it, and I control the way it's perceived by other people. And also by making it complex, which is one of the reasons why they did it in China, for example, with the Hanzi, and then subsequently adopted in Japan with the kanji, is the idea of secrecy. Only as the elites and a certain chosen group, oftentimes in connection with religion, has the knowledge to read the information. So you protect it from your enemies. You make sure you're the only ones that can exchange that sort of information. And also it's a way to make sure you harvest the knowledge and keep it in the upper classes while the population doesn't have a clue.
Hence little pictures. But that's lost to us now. We can only guess. Next. How did the Egyptians become pharaohs? Pharaoh is a Greek word. But it derives from the Egyptian per-a'a, which literally translated means great house. Specifically, that great house is the royal palace, and a little bit like we refer now sometimes to the Prime Minister and the things that he does as Downing Street. Downing Street says this, or the White House. The White House today said to mean the president. The Great House of Egypt came to mean Pharaoh. Pharaoh came to be referred to as the Great House, and that word in Greek is Pharaoh. And again, at a certain point now lost to us, one individual among probably localized group of people, like a tribe in a particular part of Egypt, rises to the top of society, comes to command everybody else or be in charge of everybody else. Eventually somebody like that came to be in charge of all of the people living in the northern Nile Valley and Delta region.
I think that's the way it happens in tribal societies, is that the wealthiest and most successful individual, the one that then will be able to give something back in forms of barter and in forms of food and herds and flocks and all that kind of stuff and territory, will surround himself with other people, other men that then will protect him. And that creates a cycle, because then more men will be able to be accrued, and now you can go and take land from people that don't have the same level of success. And it's very tribal in its origin. Any form of government, whether it be monarchy, whether it be theocracy, whether it be the pharaohs of Egypt in this case, or the dynasties in China, at the end of the day, it all stems from a successful tribal family within a village that manages to create a cycle of reward, protection, food, shelter, rinse and repeat.
The territory we recognize as the nation state of ancient Egypt. And that office was, generally speaking, passed from one pharaoh to his eldest son. Didn't always work like that. Sometimes the eldest son predeceased the father. Sometimes we can assume probably there were squabbles between children. Other times the throne might have been seized by somebody unrelated. But generally speaking, the office of pharaoh is not something you can aspire to unless you are born into the royal family. It's a hereditary monarchy that way.
Right. Hereditary monarchy with a certain component of a theocracy, really, because at the end of the day, these were living gods from the perspective of the population and, of course, the perspective of the ruling elites. Monarchy does have a certain level of divine right, but when it comes to this, the reason why I'm saying it's closer to a theocracy is because the role of a pharaoh is a little closer to the role of a pope, if you think about it. But even more than that, because they declare themselves to be gods. So it's even more theocratic than the Vatican. And there are so many pointers that I can bring up. Even the point that oftentimes is presented with the idea of, oh, but the ancient Greeks said that the ancient Egyptians were all black, is false. It's very much cherry picking, because at the end of the day, you can find Greek authors that tell us, oh, the inhabitants of the city of Feline were black-skinned. What does that tell you? That the others weren't, or at least not in their entirety. When you're presented with the evidence, it becomes a matter of reason and logic. Something that people that have obsessions and are invested or have agendas will not use.
Why did the pharaohs wear false beards? That is a good question. So they did wear false beards, and we can see sometimes that particularly the long divine type beards. For example, Tutankhamun is wearing one in the famous death mask. We can tell those are false beards because they also have little straps to hold them on, to hold them in place. For some reason, a beard of that kind comes to be associated with divinity, with the gods. And wearing a beard of that kind comes to be a signifier of divinity. So the king is able to wear a divine beard because he was thought to be semi-divine. The gods also have these beards. I suppose, again, thinking about purification and purity, Egyptians were generally clean-shaven, and that was probably about keeping nasties that could lurk in beards at bay. And maybe having a divine...
I don't know, I'm not convinced with this idea of, as he says, keeping the nasties. Maybe, but maybe it was just a fashion. Maybe it was just the way they thought that's what looks good. Because if you have a little bit of a beard, even the length the professor has, which is a little longer than mine, to be honest, as long as you don't have a massive beard, I really don't think that that would be the reason for it, but it's just me being a little skeptical, I suppose. I'm afraid this is one of those statements that someone says, people repeat, and at the end of the day becomes a fact.
Divine or false beard was a way of kind of adorning your face in that way without the risk of lice and nits and things infecting you. Next, why did the pharaohs marry their siblings? It is true that the pharaohs did marry their sisters. Pharaohs could have more than one wife. We have lots of evidence that shows that in lots of cases they married more than one sister, and those sisters had children by their brothers, which all seems a bit unthinkable to us. We think probably that the reason for this was that the Egyptians had no understanding of the potential genetic complications that might arise from a relationship like this, but also they believed that royal blood was special, and therefore you ought to only marry within the family to keep.
I think it's the second.
The line pure.
I think it's the second. Because at the end of the day, how long is it going to take? Apart from the fact that it's not only the Egyptians. I mean, again, the Ptolemaic dynasty was famous/infamous for it. There were some medieval kingdoms where the royal family did this too. And it's always the second one. It's always the matter of we need to keep the blood, the royal dynasty pure. We don't want to intermingle with other what have you. But at the end of the day, so it's a matter of power, it's a matter of power preservation, but I don't really think that it makes sense to think, well, they didn't understand the genetics of it, and so what? I mean, have a few kids like that, and then you'll start seeing it, and people are not stupid. I think the reality of fact is they were okay with it, they didn't care. They cared more about the maintenance of power, the in-group versus out-group, the we are superior position and the advantages that it provided over, even if that meant that you could have some chances of your kids having some problems. And again, there are entire dynasty families that we see, they have some facial deformations, for example, because of it. Did they know about genetics? No, but then again, the Romans didn't know about a lot of things and still figured out how to make steel, how to make all sorts of things that you would think they needed modern tech, but they don't. You need modern tech to know exactly why things happen, and you need modern tech and modern understanding in order to see exactly what's happening, of course, at the molecular level. But then again, you don't need modern tech when you have experiential knowledge, particularly when it's spread throughout centuries and sometimes millennia, to figure out if I do this, this happens, if I don't do that, that happens, and if I mix this with that, then I get a better product or a better steel. I don't believe that. I think it's illogical to think, well, they didn't understand the genetics of it, so they didn't know. It could cause some trouble, developmental trouble in the kids. You could see it. All you need is a couple of generations really to figure that one out.
Sisters of Pharaoh would be considered to be of the best possible stock and therefore the most suitable for a union with the king. All seems a bit wrong to us, doesn't it? But it was the done thing for the kings of Egypt. How long did the Egyptians live? I'm not sure how to interpret this question.
They are asking about general mortality rates and age expectation for the general population.
We can be pretty sure that some Egyptians lived into perhaps their 80s or even 90s. So we have evidence of one or two kings, Pepi of the 6th dynasty, Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty, who reigned for an extremely long time. We have textual evidence for that. And even if in those two cases they came to the throne at a very young age, the length of their reign shows that they must have lived to a grand old age.
I wonder if he's going to talk about the lower ends of the population and middle class, because when you look at the upper class, the fact that they may have a higher life expectancy has to do with nutrition, which is also why you don't really use normally the upper class to represent a general population, even when talking about height. That is because, again, access to a certain type of nutrition will strongly shape the way, particularly in your early age of development, will definitely mess with those numbers and percentages. But I want to see if he speaks about all classes of population in general.
There are one or two other individuals as well who we know must have been 70s, 80s, maybe even older, and we can assume that there are other individuals we have no evidence for, we don't know anything about, who also lived that long. In general, however, to get to the age of, say, about 40 was a pretty decent achievement for your average Egyptian. So they certainly didn't have the same life expectancy that we would have in modern societies.
What do you base it on, Professor? Because children mortality is usually what is brought forth to change the averages, but it is averages that you're talking about. It's the same in classical antiquity, it's the same in the medieval period. Not that I'm trying to be pedantic, but stated the way you did makes it sound every Egyptian, if they get to 40, they are lucky, which means most people didn't get to 40 and died in their 30s, in their 20s. That is absolutely not the case. It's not the case in classical antiquity either. When you read a number that gives you an average, like the average life expectancy is 40, it only means that that average is influenced by child mortality, which means if you survive as a child, then your chances of reaching 60, 70 are actually pretty high. But what messes with the average, and the reason why you get a 40 average sometimes, is because there were quite a lot of people that died as infants. And therefore, that kind of factors in. Very important to specify that, or it will create a myth.
Now, and yet at the same time, a lot of us in modern times won't live as long as the oldest of the ancient Egyptians. Next, what did the Egyptians eat and drink?
Lovely.
I guess the staples of their diet were bread made from grains that were cultivated in the fields up and down the Nile Valley and in the Delta. They ate meat of various kinds. They kept cattle, also ducks, geese, which were eaten for meat, a lot of fish from the Nile, and then fruit and vegetables. Fruit like they had dates, they had grapes, they were able to make wine from grapes. Dates grown in date palms, as they are up and down the Nile Valley in Egypt today. They also drank beer, and we in fact have the evidence of breweries from the 18th dynasty city of Amarna, and residue in some of the jars have enabled scientists to reproduce the beer from Amarna. We also have jars of beer preserved in the tomb of Tutankhamun, also wine. I don't know of anybody ever having tried to recreate the wine, but Tutankhamun ale.
I am so going to get that. Tutankhamun ale. I want to see if I can Google it, maybe Amazon. I would totally try that. I mean, ale means, of course, it's not going to have any bubbles in it, but I don't mind ale when I'm in England. Sometimes I try it. That could be interesting, as long as I can drink it cold, which I don't think they could have. So, of course, there is that. You have to imagine. But then again, it's an alternative to water.
Brewed based on a recipe deriving from residues in the tomb, was brewed for the 70th anniversary of the discovery of King Tut's tomb. That was in 1992, and you could buy the beer in Harrods.
I'll get it.
So they had beer.
They also had honey.
Which, by the way, thanks to the fermentation process, was probably cleaner and safer to drink than the water was. So just as in, say, historic times, even here, beer was drunk, partly because people liked it, partly because of its mind-altering properties, perhaps, but also it was just a good option, health and safety-wise. Next, what jobs did the Egyptians do? Most Egyptians would have been subsistence farmers. They would have farmed small parcels of land, kept some of the produce probably for themselves, exchanged some of it among local communities. Some of that produce would have been taken to temples in the form ceremonial of offerings to the gods, but that produce would then have been redistributed to other people. So farmers, there would have been craftsmen of various kinds, builders of houses, woodworkers, stoneworkers, eventually metal workers. There would have been scribes, there would have been administrators. The people that we know most about are the people of the elites who left behind monuments, stelae, statues, tombs, recording their titles. And most of those are elite level administrators or senior members of the clergy. So senior priests, members perhaps of Pharaoh's court, military men, people involved in the judiciary in making laws and enacting laws and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd say that's almost always the case, isn't it? That's why I think it would be lovely to make a series dedicated to the poor people, to the regular everyday man and woman of all sorts of ancient societies. That would be a fantastic thing to do, but it would absolutely be harder because of what he has just stated.
But every occupation that a pre-industrial society might have needed was, of course, represented in the Egyptian population, as you would expect. Next, did the Egyptians believe in curses? Kind of. There are inscriptions in particularly tomb context, essentially saying, don't rob this tomb, don't desecrate, violate this tomb, or such and such a nasty thing will happen to you. I guess that's the closest sort of thing to what we would think of as a kind of curse. Next, how many gods did the Egyptians have? Too many for anybody to have ever counted, I think is the right answer. The way I like to answer this, very geeky answer I'm afraid, is that a few years ago, maybe about 20 years ago, an 8-volume encyclopedia listing the names of gods and goddesses was published. So if each one of those volumes is sort of an inch or two thick, and the pages of those volumes contain only the names of the gods and goddesses and a little bit of reference information about where the evidence for those gods and goddesses comes from, then that gives you an idea of how many. It's thousands and thousands, and I don't think anyone will have a definitive number. Did the Egyptians have electricity? Nope. No, they didn't. Probably the least said about that, the better. I know some people think maybe the pyramids were power stations or something, but anyway, they weren't. They didn't have electricity. Next. Who did the Egyptians fight? The Egyptians had interactions with people on all sides. So to the south of Egypt, the Nile Valley extends into what is Sudan. There were various groups of non-settled peoples of various kinds. The largest settled population to the south of Egypt in ancient times was the Kingdom of Kush.
Yes.
The Egyptians fought the Kushites from time to time. To the east of Egypt is the Red Sea. To the west is the Libyan desert. There were various migrant tribes in what we now think of as Libya who raided Egypt and eventually came to settle there. The Egyptians engaged them in battle. So we've got Kushites to the south, Libyans to the west. The best records we have probably for Egyptian military activity comes from the New Kingdom and later. And during the 18th, 19th, 20th dynasties.
Look how beautiful. My gosh, the colours. Egyptian blue being clearly something that they were very famous for, something that became popular in the Mediterranean basin in general. It was something that was exported. The Greeks bought it, the Romans bought it, and they even started to reproduce it in Italy at some points. And then, of course, the Greeks had also their own types of blues, as I mentioned on a dedicated video dedicated to blue in ancient Greece. They also had their own production, which was a different type, probably a different hue. But Egyptian blue is wonderful to see every time I see it. It just amazes me.
The Egyptians engaged in relations of one kind or another, including field battles with the Hittites, the so-called Sea Peoples, the Mitanni, later on,
the Romans,
after Libyans and then Kushites, the Persians, or the Assyrians of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Persians of the Persian Empire. The Egyptians did not fight Alexander the Great and his armies. They welcomed Alexander, whose enemies were the Persians, so there was kind of your enemy's enemy is your friend situation there. Of course, the Ptolemaic Egyptians fought the Romans. Egypt was a major player in the ancient Mediterranean world, and as such was vying for control of territory and resources and political clout with all of its neighbours. So it's a fair bet that if there was another great power in the ancient Mediterranean world at any point, Egypt probably fought them. Probably got most of them, I think.
I think, yeah, it was a good answer.
But
The big one, go.
Next, did the Egyptians have slaves? So people will want to ask this question because for a very long time it was thought
There we go.
that the very grandest building projects like the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza could only have been undertaken using forced labour. How on earth could anybody build an enormous building like that without forcing people to do it? And that myth is partly created by ancient writers, including Herodotus. Archaeological excavations in the last 20 or 30 years of the town and cemetery nearby of the workers who actually did the building at Giza of the Great Pyramid and other monuments around and about show that actually they were extremely well organised. They were probably pretty well fed, and most probably they were not forced labourers. And I think maybe for anybody who has a hard time imagining that anybody would voluntarily sign up to the construction of the Great Pyramid.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a job at that point. If you get paid, that's what you do.
You have to remember that you've completely bought into the myth of state with a pharaoh at the head of state and the pharaoh being a god. And if you make sure pharaoh is happy, pharaoh appeases the gods, then everything in the world will be right and harmonious. And if you get that wrong, the gods will send down all kinds of terrible punishments. So I think we have to imagine that actually that sort of mentality helps Egyptians in ancient times to buy into big construction projects like great grand pyramids without pharaoh needing to coerce them into it. So we...
Well, yeah, but then again, I don't know. I mean, it's a good element. It's an element, but it's not a conducive element in the sense of being everything. Like, it's not like we have never done stuff like that without any sort of, oh, the gods will be happy with it. We do it today. As long as you pay people, they will do it. It's a job. And in fact, if it's a long job, it means that it gives you more security. And if that's what you do, that's what you do. As I say, you're a skilled worker, you're a stonemason, you're whatever you are. If that's what you know how to do, and that's your job, and that's your skill, and you get it, it's great. You got a job, you can feed your family. I mean, at the end of the day, sure, I'm not saying that it didn't play a part into, for example, people's morale or how people felt about the work that they were doing or who they were working for. Some people, absolutely. Like the way he's pointing out, and I apologize if this sounds like a straw man, I don't mean it to be, but the way he said it sounds like, well, you either have coercion or you have the state religious propaganda, and that's how you're going to convince people to do it without coercing them, and I disagree. It could have played a part. It may have made it easier. It may have made it in a way culturally significant. But if you pay them and it's a job, and once we have decided that the evidence now points to the idea that these were paid workers, then at the end of the day, as I say, that's all you need to convince. Give them a stipend and food.
We think probably that at least for the occasions when people tend to think the Egyptians probably used slaves, they probably didn't, in fact. Next question. Oh, it's the end. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope
Thank you.
You might have learned a little tiny something about ancient Egypt, maybe from the answers to these questions. Don't forget to like this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more fantastic history-related, ancient Egypt-related content. See you soon.
Okay, so I'm definitely checking out the medieval one next, because I can see that at the very end, this one here, so that could be the medieval historian checking out stuff like that would be great. That's another good face, but his face was better. Again, I enjoyed watching the video. It's just the cop-out kind of annoyed me particularly. But then again, I suppose not everyone is ready to stand the ground, but I can tell you this much. I will. Thank you very much, noble ones, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.